ASMR Retro Forever. Hey guys, welcome back to ASMR Retro. Today I'm going to talk about a Netflix documentary series called High Score. In particular, the first episode, Boom or Bust. And this is actually a request from one of my patrons by the name of Manolito Vanderwand. So thank you very much for that request, Manolito. He actually upgraded to the Super Broski Tier. So if any of you want to make any kind of ASMR request, check out my Patreon. The link will be in the description. So High Score is a documentary about the history of video games. And I've seen, quite a few of these types of documentaries before, either on YouTube or whatever. And some are good, some aren't that good. But this one was really good. I enjoyed this quite a bit. The production values were quite high. It had these cool, pixel graphics, animations to tell parts of the story, which was cool. The music was cool. Just very well done overall. But it wasn't overproduced either. There's a lot of substance to it. It wasn't all style, you know what I mean? And some of this stuff I knew already. Some of it was new, and some of it was, they told more of a, more of a human aspect. It told the story from perspective of people that we don't usually see in these kinds of things, I think, which was nice. But anyways, you'll see what I mean as I go through it. But, and by the way, the game footage you see is games that are featured in the documentary. Not all the games, but some of them. And they're not going to line up necessarily to what I'm saying, so I just don't want anybody to be confused. But anyway, we start off with Space Invaders and its creator, Tomohiro Nishikaru. I think you say Nishikaru. I'm going to butcher these names, I know, but basically he was influenced by War of the Worlds, and he pictured the aliens as giant octopuses, octopi. You know what I mean? So the game was released in 1978 in Japan, and it was Japan's first arcade blockbuster. It was a massive success, and so much so that the Japanese government had to declare a shortage of 100 yen coins, which is pretty crazy. And they talk about it was also inspired by Atari's Breakout. But they talk about when they were designing the game, and Nishikaru said that he experimented with different types of enemies, like tanks, planes, soldiers. But then he's like, it's wrong to shoot people, basically. So they thought about droids because Star Wars was pretty big. It just come out in the States, and it was a phenomenon or whatever. But I guess they ended up on millions. And this is one of my favorite parts, is that it shows him looking through his original design book for the game, just hand-drawn and handwritten notes and stuff like that. And the book's all falling apart and stuff like that, but it's so cool. I love that kind of stuff. I wish they actually scanned it in and reproduced it for sale. I would definitely buy that. I would love to have that. But yeah, then you can see where he drew the design of the different creatures. So you would see squid type creature, an octopus, a crab, or whatever. And then on the next page you see a graph where he kind of pixelized it, so to speak, digitized it so that it could be put in the game. And he's like, this is how they used to design games, on paper. Obviously they don't do that anymore. They can't really do that with the complexity of games nowadays. Let's see. You can even see when he's flipping through the book, some, I don't know what you call them, decision trees or logic trees. I forgot what you call those diagrams. And then maybe you see some code and stuff like that. So that was really cool to see that. And then Nishikaru says, it's kind of funny. He's like, I don't have the skill to beat the second level of the game. It's kind of embarrassing. So that was funny. And I'm like, man, it can't be that hard. I played the game a long time ago as a kid. Didn't really remember how hard it actually was. So when I'm playing it for the making, or for the, I play the game just to use this footage for this video, and I'm like, man, this is pretty tough. I don't think I beat the second level either. So I first level. But yeah, it's a pretty tough game for sure. And there's a great transition on this part where Nishikado's looking over the city, and you see the clouds, and they're all, the camera pans up to the clouds, and then the clouds turn dark, and I think there's some lightning or whatever, and then Space Invaders, the game, like overlaid onto the cloud, and then it pans back down, and you're in this theater, and someone is playing the game. So that was a really, really, really cool transition they did there. And then, so now, we're introduced to Rebecca and Heinemann, and she talks about how it was the first game that had strategy. Talked about how she played in the Atari National Video Game Championship in 1980, and there's that saying like, this is way before the days of esports, obviously, and they also showed like really awesome footage of malls in the 1980s, and this is another one of my favorite parts. It's so cool to see that. I grew up partially in the 80s, and I just find this stuff fascinating. Like I remember it, but it's all in a haze. One thing is to see movies modern movies trying to recreate what the 80s were like, and even seeing movies that were made in the 80s is different than actually being there in person, kind of thing. So that gave you a chance to see what it was like with the frizzy hair and all that stuff. And I tell you, man, if I could go back in time, I'd love to go, to the, let's say, mid 80s and walk through a shopping mall or something like that. And man, it'd be such a trip, because again, like, it'll be familiar, but also not familiar. So you're just like, oh yeah, I remember that, or what's this? It would just be so cool to see products and stuff like that, and like, oh, there's a food court. Oh, McDonald's was so different back then. Oh, like, I don't know, it'd just be really cool. I'd rather go back to like the 80s or something than go back in time to like 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, or maybe even to the future. I don't know. Anyway, but they're saying that the LA regional qualifiers for the championship was held in a mall, so that's why they're showing mall footage. And she entered the tournament, and she won, Rebecca. So she went on to the final, and then she reveals to the audience that she's trans, which was interesting. And she said that Space Invaders, as a kid, allowed her to be herself. She was in a virtual world, ignoring the world around her, allowed her to escape and feel a sense of peace. So I thought that was a very interesting, different view. Again, that's one of those things that you don't usually see in these types of documentaries. So that was pretty cool. She won the mall competition and went on to the finals. So I said that already. And then they talk about the importance of a high score in those old games and how it encouraged people to want to do better. The first time high scores were featured in games was Space Invaders, and Nishikado says that it's a replay appeal. I think we would call it replay value, but same concept. And it's really important for arcade games because they want people to keep plopping in quarters. So it's a pretty smart idea. And by the way, throughout the documentary, there's like great footage of like Atari commercials and stuff like that, and they're probably all available on YouTube. But it's always cool to see. And then they talk about a bit about flow, which it's basically when you're in the zone. We all know what that's like. And then they talk about how the Space Invaders led to the video game revolution in the States, and people started getting too good at games, and they need to find a way to keep people challenged and to keep being, basically. So they introduced us to Doug McCrae, so I can't remember, sorry about that. Let's call him Doug. And while he was in college, he brought a pinball machine into his dormitory, and that made a lot of money. So then he started bringing more and more pinball machines and video games, and started making a lot of money. And he was able to pay his tuition from quarters, which is pretty amazing. Not actually quarters, but you know what I mean, like from the money he made there, he would able to afford his tuition. Then you got 3 Missile Command machines that did very well at the first week, but then by the third week, the revenue dropped quite a bit. drop it another quarter. But people were getting so good at the games that they can play for a really long time without the need to put in any more quarters. So what they did was they started making enhancement kits to make the game harder and more interesting and different. Basically, it was the world's first video game mod. Maybe, I'm guessing, I don't know. Like a DLC where, well, without the DL. But, yeah, sure enough, they attached their own kit to the motherboard of Missile Command, and they called it Super Missile Attack, and sold 1,000 copies in a couple of months for, I think, $250 each. So that's quite a bit of money pretty quickly. Just flip my notes here. Okay. Alright. And then we're introduced to Toru Awatani. So back in Japan, he noticed that it was mostly men in arcades playing games, and they wanted to find a way to make women more interested in games. So they figured, okay, maybe we can do something with food, because the games centered towards men had more to do with killing, which is kind of funny. But so while eating pizza, he removed the slice, and it formed the Pac-Man shape, and that's where he got the idea for Pac-Man. Now, I had heard that story before, but I also heard that it was a myth. But I guess it's true because it came from the man himself. They talked about how they kept the design of Pac-Man visually simple. They thought it would be a hit in Japan, but not so much in America. But as we all know, it was a huge hit in America. But I didn't know that it was such a hit with women, and I didn't even know it was supposed to be a women-centric game. Let's see. Yeah, it was a huge sensation with music, cereal, cartoons, etc. All the merchandise. So then Doug and Steve, the guys who made the kit, they made a kit for Pac-Man. And let's see. And then they hired Mike Horowitz. I think that's how you say it. And so they reverse engineered it. They added new mazes, random ghost patterns, sounds, etc. So now we're introduced to Nolan Bushnell. He started Atari, and their motto was work hard, play hard, in terms of their, employee culture. So it was more of like a very relaxed culture where they didn't care what time you showed up or what you wore, whatever, as long as you got results, that's all that mattered. And there's like stories of like, people smoking pot and like partying and all that stuff in the offices, but I'm not sure how accurate that is, but anyways. And then so yeah, Atari like got huge, made tons of money with arcades and consoles and blah blah blah, and then eventually it was sold to Warner Communications, and then 2 years after that, Bushnell was out. Now, I don't know when they say out if they mean he got fired or he left or what, but he was out anyways. And then Atari went after the mod kit guys, Steve and Doug and Mike, for $5 million, and Atari ended up dropping the suit as long as Steve and the other guys went to work for Atari, and they got permission for future kits. And then let's see what happened. It talks about, and after that they tricked Midway in a sense to make a deal with them, because they're like, oh, we won the suit against Atari, which they didn't. They settled. It's like, well, because they wanted to release the Pac-Man thing that they made, the mod, and they're like, we'll win the suit if you try to sue us. So they ended up making a deal together, and Miss Pac-Man was born. Okay. And so back to Rebecca Heineman. Just mentioned how they showed about like the competition, the finals, and she ended up winning. And yeah, so that's that. And then she's like, I think it took like an hour and 47 minutes or something like that. And then she put the good controller down. She's like, I never want to play this again. It's kind of funny. But anyways, then we're introduced to Lawson, who he wasn't in it because he passed away in 2011, but it showed his son and his son's wife and his grandson. But anyways, oh, by the way, and then, well, I'll get that in a sec, but basically he was an engineer, and an African-American engineer, and he liked to, on his spare time, tinker with, like in his garage, just building his own arcades and stuff like that for fun. And then, when his bosses found out, they wanted him to design a game console, or help design a game console called Channel F, which was the first console to use cartridges. Because before they would have like a Pong console, and that was it. You would have Pong, and you might have a few different settings, but this was the first time they had cartridges. And then they talk about how Atari came out, sometime after that, and kind of overshadowed his story, so the story kind of got lost. But yeah, this was a pretty heartwarming part of the story, because he finally got some recognition for his contribution to the industry, and it showed his family and stuff like that. And I really liked the pixel graphics that they showed on some parts where he's like opens the computer and he's looking inside, or just him in his garage working. So I really liked this segment. That was well done. And then finally there was the part about Howard Scott Warshaw, which I'm not going to talk about too much because I think most people, the story's been done to death, but anyways, he was a programmer at Atari. He made Heroes Revenge, Rizzo, Stark, some other games, and then they wanted him to make E.T., extraterrestrial, based on the movie, and he only had 5 weeks to make it because they wanted to make the holiday deadline, and he said he could do it. So he worked like day and night, and actually before he started programming, he went to meet Steven Spielberg in his office to talk about the concept, and he tells his whole concept for the game, and Spielberg's like, oh, can't you just make it something like Pac-Man, which I thought that was funny, which he probably should have done. I thought it would have been easier, and better. But anyways, the game ended up being terrible, or yeah, most people say it's terrible. And then Atari ended up, or the video game market in North America crashed. I'm not sure about Europe, but Japan, it was still strong. But some people say it was because of E.T., but it wasn't. Partially maybe, I don't know. But there's a lot of, there were other, like they said, the Pac-Man home console version was sucked, which it did, compared to the arcade anyways. And there was just so many like bad games, and just so much, quantity over quality, I guess. And then it shows like some news footage of this disappointed kid playing Pac-Man, and he's like, I thought it would be different. I thought it would be more like the arcade version, which kind of made me laugh because I can relate to that as a kid. You don't know any better. You're like, oh, I got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game for Nintendo, and then you see the graphics are nothing like, and the music is nowhere near as good as the arcade. And by the way, I actually kind of like the NES version better than the arcade version, but there's no doubt the graphics and music are not there. But I don't know, I just thought that was funny. I'm kind of like, yeah, welcome to the jungle, kid. Like, yeah, because that was kind of a new concept back then, that home consoles aren't nearly as powerful as arcade games. And yeah, so that was the end of the episode, and the market crashed, and yeah, that was basically it. So overall, I really enjoyed this documentary a lot. I love these video game documentaries, especially about the early days of video games. It reminds me of, I've seen King of Kong, A Fistful of Quarters, I think that's what it's called, and it's not about the history of games, but it's about the Donkey Kong high score with Billy Mitchell and all that stuff. So it's about those olden days, I guess. So I find that stuff like super fascinating. And yeah, this was very well produced. It told some really nice stories, and you got some history. So overall, very well done documentary. This is just the first episode, and I can't wait to watch more of them. And I want to thank Manolito Vendor for his request to